For hundreds of great shows like this one, go to OnNetworks.com.
Video game designers haven't really enjoyed the notoriety of like film directors or musicians yet. Even though what they do is in art, they're never really household names.
Even though the gaming industry makes more money than even the movie industry, the guys who actually design and create the games just aren't very well known. They're not rock stars. The two guys who came closest to being rock stars, however, are John Carmack and John Romero, the two Johns.
You know, they're not quite household names, but they did kind of live a rock and roll lifestyle, or the video game equivalent of that.
So between John Romero and John Carmack, you basically had two sides of the game designer coin. On one side, the John Romero side, you had the creative visionary. On the other side of the coin, you had John Carmack, who basically represents the brain, the programming mind.
You know, and to make a good game, you have to have someone with a great idea, a great vision, and then you have to have someone who can code that great vision and turn it into a reality.
Now, John and John originally made a company called Softus. It was a company that made PC games. Now, back in 1990, John Carmack had figured out a way to recreate the kind of smooth side-scrolling action of Nintendo games on a personal computer.
The most popular platformer at the time, and probably of all time, is Super Mario Bros. 3. So Carmack kind of took it apart and reverse engineered it and put it back together on a PC. And then they took it to Nintendo and said, hey, you know, you can take this hit game you have on the consoles and bring it to a wider audience.
And Nintendo said, yeah, thanks, and they just closed the door in their face. I mean, Nintendo had no intention of taking its games off of its systems.
It's not a complete loss, though, because they take the technology they've developed and create Commander Keen, which was the first 2D scrolling platformer for the PC.
So then the two Johns took their Commander Keen money and started their own company. They called it id Software, and they started playing around with 3D stuff. They had Catacombs 3D, Hover Tank 3D, stuff that was really just a toe in the water of modern 3D gaming.
They were both exercises that were leading up to something much bigger, which they completely dropped in the world in a big way in '92 with Wolfenstein 3D.
Catacombs and Hover Tank are great, but Wolfenstein takes what they've learned from those games, improves on it, and then puts it in this Nazi-killing shell. And it's just a huge hit, and everyone can't get enough of it.
Back then, the concept of having a first-person point of view, of going through a 3D maze, of having different weapons, of fighting vaguely realistic characters, even speech synthesis, this was all brand new stuff, and it spawned a billion-dollar industry.
It single-handedly established the first-person shooter genre. You know, you're hunting down Nazis in this like mystical quest, just this ridiculous, over-the-top, but like balls-out, pulp novel-inspired story that Romero brought to the table. Also started to lay a framework for what the basic story types and what the basic vernacular of the first-person shooter was going to be.
Wolfenstein's not the original first-person shooter, but Mario's not the original platformer. But they're the games that kind of define the genres and set the rules. They're milestones.
So these guys worked really well in tandem, but the world hadn't seen anything yet from them, because the next year was when they finally dropped Doom.
In Doom, you're a nameless space marine on Mars who has to fight the bad guys who come out of a portal from hell. But the plot is irrelevant. It's the action that really makes the game so special. It's Carmack and Romero at their best.
It runs so quickly. I mean, it just like nothing you've ever seen. It was just like hyper real, hyper in your face, it completely like broke down the boundaries that you were used to having when you played a game.
But the real thing it brought to the table was multiplayer. You would use your modem and actually compete against other people. Now most first-person shooters are built with that in mind. You know, they're exclusively multiplayer, like Team Fortress or Counter-Strike. It's a major component of games that didn't exist before Doom.
If you think about all the things we take for granted today, online multiplayer, death matches, user mods, all of those come from Doom.
1996, they come out with Quake, whereas Doom and Wolfenstein took place in 3D, Quake is actually truly 3D, and that it is polygons and true height. They really went all out.
Romero, again, brings his distinctive aesthetic to the table, brought Nine Inch Nails' Trent Reznor to design the sound, creating level design and just an unbelievable sense of scope that you've never gotten in a game.
By this time, in 1996, the two Johns are living the rockstar life. They're millionaires, big mansions, they have matching Ferraris. You know, and why shouldn't they? Their products are in the hands of millions and millions of consumers.
Romero and Carmack became two of the biggest names gaming had ever seen. They were these dynamic guys, highly egotistical, who flaunted their success.
They've made the most successful computer games of all time, and they've become rich from it. and that's awesome.
So at first, these two distinct personalities worked together, meshed together really well, and they made great games like Doom. But later on in their career, they were really kind of conflicted against each other.
Romero wanted all the emphasis on cool design and storytelling and plot, while Carmack was really only interested in the technological back end. He wanted all the emphasis to go into the programming and the special effects.
Of course, with all the success comes a lot of egos clashing, and this is the part of the Behind the Music special where we get the sad music because the band breaks up.
On one hand, Carmack stays with id. The other, Romero, goes off to start what he promises is going to be a company that will radicalize the gaming industry, Ion Storm.
He set his company up on the 54th floor of the prestigious JP Morgan building in Dallas. They had a big movie screening studio in there. They had a huge 10-foot wide marble version of their logo right when you walked into the office.
They had arcades. They had solid oak furniture. Their offices are a tribute to excess.
Once Romero was free of id, he focused all his attention into Ion Storm and one game in particular, Daikatana.
So Daikatana was supposed to be John Romero's dream vision of the perfect video game. If Quake had 7 weapons and 10 different monsters, well then Daikatana was going to have 25 weapons and 64 monsters spread across 4 different time zones.
He focuses on this excess in the way he makes the company, but also in his games. And instead of doing something new, he just makes it bigger. Instead of 7 weapons, there's 100 weapons. But that's not what makes the game good. I mean, if you look at Portal's a game with 1 weapon. It's not about having just 1,000 minor variations on a machine gun. And he kind of loses sight of that.
So for Daikatana, the hype machine was in full effect. Romero was in Time and Newsweek talking about the game. They had the world's most obnoxious advertising campaign where it said John Romero's gonna make you his bitch and that you should suck it down.
The ad seems like it was written by a pro wrestler in the mid-90s. It's like something Stone Cold Steve Austin would say when he was cutting a promo. It's not really advertising the product. It's just like boasting and being cocky.
Even better, Romero said, you know what? This game is going to be out in 7 months, just in time for holiday 1997. Back over at id Software, Carmack goes, that's crazy, and he gets work on Quake 2, which actually will come out that year.
Yeah, too bad the game didn't come out in Christmas '97. In fact, it took another 3 years for the game to come out.
So by the time Daikatana does come out 3 years later, what happens? Quake 3 is out. Quake 3 was one of the greatest first-person shooter games of all time, so it makes Daikatana look like an old game.
Quake 3 kind of refines the Quake formula. Unreal Tournament throws in some new twists, and Daikatana is just the same old thing with more monsters and more weapons.
And of course, the public, after waiting for 3 years and enduring this insulting ad campaign, well, they were just ready to knock the game, and John Romero gave them plenty of opportunities to knock it.
When Daikatana came out, people were so ready to hate it that even if it was the perfect game, it still would have been hated and panned.
This would be like if right before episode 1 came out, George Lucas put a big ad in the newspapers that said, George Lucas is about to make you his bitch. And Daikatana was about as well received as episode 1.
And Daikatana ended up being a $30 million flop. It's the Ishtar of gaming.
People will tolerate you being full of yourself when you're putting out stuff like Quake and Doom. But when you're putting out stuff like Daikatana, you gotta learn a little bit of humility.
So by 2001, the story was over for Ion Storm. They closed up their Dallas office. John Romero left his head hanging in shame. Now since then, he's kind of hung around the periphery of the game industry, consulting on a couple of games here and there, but not really doing anything that notable.
Recently he was working on some mobile games. He worked at Midway for a brief stint working on the last iteration of their Gauntlet game.
But nothing that really lives up to the legacy he established with Doom, Quake, and Wolfenstein.
So John Carmack is still at id, still cranking out sequels to Quake and Doom every couple of years, and the games are fairly well received, and Carmack has continued to make progress in better graphics and new technology behind shooters, but without John Romero, the yin to his yang, it's like breaking up John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They continue to do some good stuff, but they don't have the same magic they did when they were together.
So a lot of these stories you hear about, great partnerships splitting up, they usually at least talk in the end, but the two Johns don't talk.
We anxiously await the day where Romero will triumphantly return and once again force us to suck it down. Honestly, that's what we're all waiting for.
As much as it's fun to hate on John Romero, without Romero, Carmack's programming skills would not have been realized in such an incredible, iconic way. And without Carmack's programming skills, Romero would never have been able to bring these amazing visions to life. Between the two of them, they did produce a series of games that revolutionized the industry and set it on the course that it is today.
20 years from now, what's going to happen is people aren't going to remember Daikatana. They're not going to remember John Romero's ads. What they're going to remember is John Romero and John Carmack made Doom.
It's like how no one's really gonna remember the last 10 years of the Rolling Stones or so. They released Sticky Fingers, and they're still going to be known for that to 50 and 100 years.
Eva, auf Wiedersehen.
For hundreds of great shows like this one, go to OnNetworks.com.